Now in this video we are going to continue with our discussion on the different levels or the different models of the router which we have seen. If we just go back, we have seen the Cisco hierarchy of the routers, where Cisco develops the routers in 3-layer hierarchy: access level, distribution level, and the core routers. So probably in this section we'll get into more in details on the different kinds of ports you'll find on the routers. And also, before we get into the actual ports which you'll find on the backside of the router, first we need to understand a basic classification of the routers. We have two classifications like fixed routers and modular routers. So mostly in the today's networks we don't find these fixed routers. Now the major difference is in case of fixed routers, in case of modular routers, we have some slots. You can see the routers, we have a slots available. You can see this is one slot, and on this slot we can place the cards. Okay, if you want to add any card like we do on a computer, on the computer we have some PCI slot, where some white kind of slot where you can add some graphic card, you can add some LAN card if you want, or the modem card, like that, where you have some free slots available where you can purchase the cards and you can add the cards. Now what exactly in these cards? In these cards you have some extra ports which you can connect to the router. Okay, so we have some slots available where you can add the cards, and this kind of routers we call them as modular routers. And most of the series, what you will see in today's production networks, you will find all the routers as modular routers. And the difference between fixed router, in case of fixed router, the difference is you have all the ports fixed on the motherboard. So all the ports are integrated on the motherboard and they are non-upgradable. You cannot remove these ports, you cannot add these ports. So typically your 2500 series routers, some 800 series routers. Now these routers comes under a fixed router category. Okay, so there's only one major difference between these two classifications. And most of the time in the today's networks you will find mostly modular routers, where you will definitely have some slots, and the number of slots depends upon the different models of the router. Okay, so the next thing we'll see here in this section, when the major topic will be focusing on what are the different types of ports you will find on the Cisco routers. Okay, so majorly all the ports what we have on the router, this is the backside of the router. You can see the backside of the router. Okay, so probably you'll find some ports here. You have some serial ports, you have some Ethernet ports, and there is a console auxiliary port. So we'll see the differences, but all these ports are categorized into three categories. We have a LAN ports, we have a WAN ports, and we have administrative ports. Now what's the difference between these three kinds of ports? Now the LAN port is the port which is going to connect to your switch, and typically we call this port as a LAN port. The port which is going to connect your local area network on the switch, we call that particular port as a LAN port. And the port which is going to connect to your WAN or the wide area network, or which is going to connect to the remote location, we call that particular ports as WAN ports. So more in detail on the WAN connectivity and all these things, we'll get into that more in detail in our next sections. But in this section we'll try to understand the different kinds of ports you'll find on your router generally. So three ports: LAN ports, WAN ports, and administrative ports. So let us start with first category, LAN ports. Now when you talk about LAN ports, typically the LAN ports look similar to your normal kind of port which you find on the backside of your computer, your RJ45 ports. Now you know RJ45 connectors, the port what you find on the backside of the port, similar kind of port on your routers. How many you will have, it all depends upon the different platforms of the routers. And mostly these RJ45 ports supports different speeds. Like you have some Ethernet ports which supports 10 Mbps. We may have some fast Ethernet ports which is 100 Mbps speed, and we can also have some gig Ethernet ports in some of the new routers like ISR G2 routers, 1900, 2900 series routers. You will also find some G0x0 interfaces which supports 1000 Mbps ports. Okay, so most commonly if you're using some 1800 or 2800 series routers, the most of the routers, they do support fast Ethernet as a default Ethernet port. And if you're going with some old routers like 2500 series routers, you may find some Ethernet ports also. But in today's networks, you'll either find mostly either Ethernet or gig Ethernet ports, and which port you will find, it all depends upon the different models. Okay, and you can see here these ports are my Ethernet ports, and this is my 26, I think it's 2621 series router, which is having two fast Ethernet ports inbuilt into that. Okay, so we call them as Ethernet ports, and they look like the same port what you find on the backside of your computer. And the next category of the ports, we have something called WAN ports. Now these WAN ports are the ports which are going to connect on the remote location from one router to another router. Okay, now in this Ethernet port, typically we call these WAN ports as serial ports. And here you'll find two kinds of serial ports here. So you got two kinds of serial ports. One is 26 pin serial port, which will be very small in general, and then you have some 60 pin serial ports. Now 60 pin are a little bit older ports, which you'll find probably in today's networks. You'll find mostly your 26 pin port, which is also called a smart serial port. And the good thing about this serial port is on the same one slot you can have two number of ports, and instead of having one particular port. And typically these cards, you'll find this WAN interface card, 1T card, which means one serial port, two serial ports, and also you'll find some 4T or 8T ports, something like that. We'll be getting into all these modules when we start adding the modules and all those things. But this, whenever you realize or you see something like serial ports, you have to understand this is your WAN port, which is used in your WAN connections. And the number of ports again depends upon the different models of the router. The next category of the ports which we'll see, we got a third category of the ports. We call them as administrative ports, right? So the first category is a LAN port, WAN port, and then you can see these two ports here, console and auxiliary, and these two comes under the category of administrative ports. Now what's the difference? Now the LAN ports, which is going to connect to the LAN, which is going to forward your traffic. Okay, the port which is going to connect in the LAN, we call that as a LAN port, and the port which is going to connect on the WAN, we call it as a WAN port. Typically your serial ports and Ethernet ports, we can say Ethernet, fast Ethernet. Now these two ports are actually responsible for sending and receiving the traffic, your data, it is going to send and receive. But the port, we call it as administrative ports, they don't actually carry any traffic or your data. It actually carry your commands or whatever you type on the router, which you need to configure, or for administration we call it as. Let's try to see how exactly it's going to differ. So let's take an example. I got a router here. So diagrammatically it looks, we just draw like this, and I want to configure this router. You can see this is my one router, which is a 1700 series routers. I got one router here. Now this router is more like a flat box, and it doesn't have any input or output device. So which means if I have to do any configuration on this particular router, so which means I want to configure this router. You cannot use your router without configuration. You have to go to the command line of the router and you have to configure everything in that particular command line. But if I want to do that, what I need to do? So then in that kind of scenarios, we can do something called console connection. So we're going to use this console cable. I can see this is a console cable here. Now this console cable will have one side, you have an RJ45. The down side, this is an RJ45 connector, and which is going to connect on the console port. This is a console port here. And then the other side of the cable, you have an DB9 port, nothing but your 9-pin port, which generally you'll find on the backside of your computers. We call this particular port as a COM port. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll connect one side of the cable to this particular router on the console port, and the other side we are going to connect on the computer, that is your DB9 port. Okay, we call this kind of connection, we call it as a console connection. So diagrammatically we represent something like this. We got a console cable connection. This is how you represent diagrammatically. We call this as a console connection. Now once we do this console connection, once I am done with this console connection, now we need to open one application called hyperterminal. Probably more on this, how to connect a router, we'll see probably in our next sections when we start our basic command line or PuTTY software, some terminal softwares. And once you open that, it will open up one window on your screen, computer screen, and once you power on the router here, you can see whatever is happening on the router on this computer screen. In fact, not on the computer screen, it's on this particular software or on that particular software screen. And whatever you type here, it's going to execute the same thing on the command line of the router via the console port. Okay, so we call this is actually we call this as administration, which means we are not sending any traffic through this console port. We are actually configuring our router, and if you want to configure the router, then we need to get into the command line of the router, and this console connection will allow you to get into the command line of the router by doing these things. So console connection, and then we need to open some emulation tool for that. So we call this as local administration. So the local administration means you have a router, you have a PC in the same location, and if you want to configure, we can do this kind of thing. Okay, the next thing is, just now we have discussed this console port is the one which is used for local administration. Now there is one more port which is also called as auxiliary port, and these two ports are for administration only, for doing basic configurations. But the only difference is the console is for local administration and the auxiliary port is for the remote administration. So what is the meaning of remote administration? Let's try to understand that. Let's take an example. I got a router in a different location. So I'm sitting in a different city. Let's say I'm in my city here in Hyderabad, and you got a router in a different location in a Bangalore or in different location. And what I want to do is I want to configure my router here. So my requirement is I want to configure the router by sitting here. Now normally console connection is something which is only for local administration, and I want to configure the router remotely the same way as I did via console. So in this kind of scenarios, what I can do is I can ask anyone on the remote location to connect my router to the modem, probably your dial-up modems. Okay, and the same way I'm going to connect my computer to a dial-up modem, and then these two dial-up modems are actually connecting to each other through a telecom line, and then through that telecom line, and every telephone line will have some number to dial up. So I'm going to dial to that particular number, and I'm going to connect remotely to that particular modem, and then I can do the similar kind of connection here, and I can do the same thing what I can do via console, and we call this as remote administration. But again, to make this remote administration, you need to have a separate set of dial-up connections of modems on both the sides, and you need someone to be there to configure or provide the connectivity on the remote location as well as on your location. Okay, so we use the same console cable here which we use, but the converter will be different based on the modem. You need to convert that into mostly DB25 25 pin converter you will find on the modems. We connect onto that particular modem. Okay, so we can do the same thing like what we did via console by using actually via remotely, we can say. Okay, so the major drawback with this kind of auxiliary connection is one thing, it is not reliable. That's reliability is one of the major factor, and it doesn't support your high-speed data transfers because it's just a dial-up connection, and also it is not reliable. Okay, so most of the production network scenarios in today's networks, I generally every location you have some engineer who can do the console connection, and he can do the basic configurations, and I can sit and access the device remotely via telnet. So there's one more way to access the devices remotely via telnet, or in routers we call it as VTV lines. We'll be getting into this how to use telnet, how it's going to work more in detail in the later on sessions. So telnet is the most common way of accessing the devices remotely in today's networks. Okay, but you have two different types of ports which you'll find on every Cisco router. We have a console port which is for the local administration, and we have another port called auxiliary port which is for the remote administration. Okay, so the next thing, now if you're using some of the old routers, let's say in case if you have some 2500 sys routers, probably this is end of sale, no more from the Cisco. But if you're using some in the lab environment, if you're using some 2500 sys routers, you'll find one interface called AUI interface. We call this interface as attachment unit interface. So which is typically a 15 pin connector you will have, and this is actually your Ethernet port only. So it supports only Ethernet, mostly E0 port. It supports up to 10 Mbps Ethernet 0 port. But if you just talk about the LAN, if you remember, in the LAN we use which kind of connector for all our cabling? We use an RJ45 connector, right? So how we are going to connect this particular router to the switch? Because in the LAN we use some straight cable and we use some RJ45 connector inside that. So we need a converter for this. Now to fix this, what we need is we need to have one converter which can convert this AUI 15 pin converter into RJ45, and that connector we call it as transceiver here. So to connect this kind of devices, we need to get a transceiver, a small device or a converter, we can say. On one side of that particular device you have a 15 pin converter which is going to connect on the router, and this end is going to connect on the router 15 pin, and on the other side of that particular converter you have an RJ45 where we are going to plug the cable RJ45 connector on this particular port. So that's how we provide the Ethernet connection in our routers if you are using some of the 1500 series, 2500 series routers in general. But whenever you see this kind of interface, you have to understand either it will be 15 pin or RJ45, and no more in today's networks, I can say, not really found in the today's routers, the new model series or the new series routers which comes from Cisco. But probably in your lab environment, or probably if you have some old routers, you may find this 15 pin converter. Mostly you'll find RJ45s. And when you talk about WAN interfaces, most of the WAN interfaces you will have serial interfaces. You have a different numbering, serial 0, serial 1, serial 0 by 0. Probably more on this numbering, I'll be getting into that in my next sections when we do the connectivity kind of thing. And you have two kinds of serial connectors. We have 60 pin or 26 pin connectors. And in some routers, again, if you're using some 2500 series routers, you will also find some BRI kind of interface, a basic rate interface. This is actually used in ISDN kind of connections, ISDN dial-up connections, and in today's networks we don't use these ISDN interfaces as well. And typically it will be more exactly the same RJ45 connector you will find, but on the backside of the router it will be written as BRI port. So whenever you see this port, you have to understand it's a one kind of WAN interface also, which is used for ISDN kind of implementations. So mostly in the new routers, it's you don't find this kind of ports generally. And then finally we have some administrative ports. We have something called console, which is RJ45 connector, which is for local administration, and we have an auxiliary port for remote administration.